Today is Wednesday, February 12th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. President Trump sets a deadline for Hamas. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a rating. You can email us right to our inbox there, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Joining me now, we're getting through all the news that's going on today. Billy Hallowell, Trey Goins-Phillips from CBN. A lot to get to. On the focus story, a watchdog is sounding the alarm about increasing anti-Christian persecution in India.
Yeah, we're going to be getting in touch with Joel Veldkamp, talking about what is happening there. Some really crazy stuff.
All right, looking forward to the details there. On the main thing, Trey and I caught up with, this woman has a powerful, powerful testimony. You talk about somebody, Trey, a life sentence for really, it was a crazy amount of sentencing for what happened, but she turned her life around.
Yeah, she has an incredible story of somebody who, sure, she did something wrong, but the miscarriage of justice and sentencing is wild, and to see how she's used her platform to point people to Christ is encouraging. Yeah,
absolutely is, and looking forward to the details there coming up on the main thing. All right, make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, including DC Debrief, Newsmakers, and more. Just look in the description here of this podcast episode. We've got all of those links you can follow in there. Just go ahead and check that out. All right, it's time now to head to the news in 90. Trump set a hard deadline for Hamas to release all hostages by Saturday at noon, warning if they're not freed, all bets are off. Hamas said it was halting hostage releases. They blamed Israel for alleged ceasefire violations. President Trump condemned Hamas, calling their treatment of hostages an absolute disgrace. Israeli leaders are preparing for possible escalation, with Netanyahu's security cabinet meeting Tuesday and the military ordered to be on high alert. Families of hostages fear for their safety, as those still in captivity could be in even worse conditions than the frail, starving men released last weekend we saw were. An American teacher, Mark Vogel, has been freed from Russian detention and is on his way back to the U.S. after a prisoner exchange negotiated by President Trump and his administration. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff brokered the deal, calling it a show of good faith from Russia amid ongoing tensions over the war in Ukraine. Vogel is 63. He was arrested back in 2021 for carrying medically prescribed marijuana and sentenced to 14 years in Russian prison. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories at cbnnews.com. The U.S. had called Vogel, by the way, they designated him as wrongfully detained, and Senator Fetterman and Governor Josh Shapiro praised Trump and his team, with Fetterman calling Vogel's return long overdue. So, guys, it's crazy now. Trump has put the deadline on Hamas, and this is something that probably should have happened a long time ago. It's insane that these people have been in captivity for so long, but Trump is putting his foot down here and just saying, no more. If you don't do this and release all these hostages, all hell's breaking loose. So he's put out the threat. We'll see what happens.
Well, there's two sides to this, right? On one side, what you were just saying, the insanity of nobody setting deadlines. When you don't set, it's like with children. If you don't discipline your children, if you say, I'm going to send you to your room, and you never send them to their room, well, then they're not going to learn, right? They're going to keep doing, and you're a parent, you know this, Dan, they're going to keep doing that same thing again and again and again. The other side of that is, once you say all hell is going to break loose, you better plan on making all hell break loose if they violate what they've said they're going to violate, right? So that's the challenge on this, but I think the tactic is the right tactic at this point.
Yeah, for sure. I think, we need to take a strong stance on issues like this, obviously. And I think it's interesting to see the bipartisan support for it, right? I think Trump went into office saying that he wanted his second term to be a presidency of common sense. And I think, obviously, there's still a lot of consternation and disagreement among Democrats with a great deal of the things Trump is doing. But to see people like Fetterman kind of coming on board with things like this, I think should be encouraging, right? That this kind of action really has bipartisan appeal. People wanted to see some action taken rather than tiptoeing around this. This isn't something we should be tiptoeing around at all. So good to see some moves in the right direction. But like you said, Billy, if necessary, we need to be able to back up our words with action. So we'll see how this all shakes out ultimately.
Yeah, right. I mean, the old, I'm going to count to 5. I mean, that's just not going to work, as long as they know when 5 comes around, nothing's going to happen. Like, well, when they get to 5, they're going to count to 8, and then they're going to count to 11. They're just hoping you just acquiesce before the countdown
They're trying
happens.
to call your bluff on it.
Yeah, exactly. So there better be something in store for Hamas if they don't follow, because this really does just need to end. I mean, it's absurd and horrific what these families have gone through and what Israelis have gone through. So we'll continue to pray there. All right, time to move to the focus story now. And a watchdog is sounding the alarm about increasing anti-Christian persecution in India, the world's most populous nation. So what's happening here?
Yeah, so Joel Veldkamp is a friend of the show. He's the head of international communications at Christian Solidarity International. And, I recently spoke with him, and he really dove into this issue of India. We talk a lot about Nigeria, and we have on this show and some of the other countries, but India has become a major, in fact, it's the 11th worst place in the world when it comes to different countries and ratings on persecution for Christians to live in. And so what you have right now is a situation where in the last 10 years, it's become incredibly hostile to Christians. There was a conflict a couple years ago over land rights that Veldkamp said really spawned into something very different. It turned into a religious conflict. Now, 80% of India, they're Buddhists, right? So, I'm sorry, they're Hindu. So, you have this Hindu stronghold, and then you have this 2% of the country who are Christians. And so that has really created a lot of issues. But in this one particular very horrific incident, 40,000 Christians were apparently forced to flee their homes a couple of years ago, members of the Kuki-Zoo community. And so they had to flee. And 2 years later, they're still living in just horrific situations as refugees.
What recently happened there that really caught the attention of the world and horrified everyone?
Yeah, so that incident that I just mentioned, that was a couple of years ago. And in these refugee camps, these people have been living in very horrific situations. But just a couple of months ago in November, there was one really horrific example of violence. There was apparently a mother of 3, a Christian woman from an indigenous group who was attacked by these Hindu militants. She was apparently raped and burned alive, just absolutely horrific situation. And that set off a whole other round of violence, according to Veldkamp, between these different groups, with people being killed and displaced even more. And he said the government is really just sort of absent from the situation, which is one of the big issues. And in fact, one governor, he said, was even found to be potentially complicit in some of this. So they're at least, their reaction is lackluster. They're not apparently doing much to stop this rising persecution issue.
Why is this week in particular important for U.S.-Indian relations?
Yeah, this is actually a really important week because the Prime Minister of India is coming to the United States today and tomorrow, and will be, Wednesday, Thursday, meeting with Trump and others. And apparently Trump has a good relationship with Modi, who is the prime minister, and they've had very friendly, in the past during the first term, got along very well. There are some other big issues going on. Obviously, you have immigration, and that'll be something that the two of them will have to talk about, and other issues as well that need to be hashed out. But one of these issues is persecution, and the hope is from Veldkamp and others that maybe Trump will put some pressure and say, hey, why is this going on? What are you going to do to stop this? And so that's one of the hopes that we have. So it's a big week for U.S.-Indian relations because of that meeting that will be happening here in America.
Yeah, and we've covered some of the things going on in India over the years, and it's really shocking, the level of Christian persecution there. You've seen pastors and people who've just converted to Christianity flogged and beaten, Bibles burned by the mass. It is crazy there. And it's, I think, one of the more underrated, I think, dangerous places for Christians out there, because normally you think, North Korea, or, some of the ones you've been reporting on, Billy, with Nigeria and in Africa, places like that. India is sort of, I don't know that it's as well known. The amount of, I'm sure this audience knows well because we've talked about it, but I think, by and large around the country, I just don't think a lot of people are aware of the craziness that goes on in India.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's one of the, I think a lot of us are not aware of any of it because we live in a country where we complain about things legitimately that are happening, but they're a drop in the bucket compared to what we just described.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, last summer, I spoke with Todd Nettleton at the Voice of the Martyrs specifically about India. So this is something I think that has increasingly been on the radar of watchdogs and people who pay attention to Christian persecution. But I think, and even Todd and I talked about this, is to the vast majority of us, I think India kind of flies under the radar. You don't think about Indian persecution of Christians because of, like you mentioned, Dan, all those other countries that, are at the top of your mind, like North Korea and like some of the countries in the Middle East. And even China. So India falls, I think, by the wayside often. And also, in addition to that, the fact that all of these other countries that I just listed have more, for lack of a better word, more traditional forms of persecution of Christians, whereas India, it is a little bit more covert. It's not direct persecution of Christians, at least not in many of the cases. So I think you don't really even realize what's happening until you're kind of knee deep into it. So certainly something to be aware of, and a good story to cover, Billy.
Any parting thoughts there, Billy, before we head on?
Yeah, I think, I hope people appreciate and understand why we're covering this so intensely again and again and again, persecution, because it is an issue that is not getting better. It is getting worse. And so that is something that you're going to continue to hear us talk about it. And we'll profile different countries as we go, because it's important for us to be praying for fellow believers and being educated about what exactly is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we certainly know the mainstream media is not going to have much interest in covering Christian persecution. Even more conservative leaning outlets that are generally friendly to Christians and faith stories, still typically it's not going to be top of mind for them in a lot of cases. Not saying that Christian persecution never gets covered, but generally it's not going to be a focus. It's certainly something that we're looking out for, as we know Christians who are following this network want updates on what's happening to the body of Christ throughout the world. So appreciate you bringing that update for us today, Billy. And we're going to move to the main thing now. And on a recent episode here of Faith versus Culture, Trey and I sat down with Judy Henderson, and she's a woman she entered into a marriage with an abusive man who ended up fatally shooting someone in a robbery gone wrong. And while she did participate in the robbery, she didn't pull the trigger, have any idea that sort of thing was going to happen. Yet her then husband somehow was acquitted, while she was sentenced to life without parole. Incredible story. And she's out now, and her perspective is something you want to hear. And part of our conversation with her is today's main thing.
How did you grapple with any of this from a faith perspective? How did you stay rooted and grounded in your faith? Because I'm sure there were times when you were even challenged, like, I don't know that, do I still believe what I thought I believed?
Correct. Yes, that was a big issue for me, because I was raised in the church all my life, or most of my life, and Pentecostal belief. So we had a deep-rooted faith in, just truth and trusting people. And whenever you hear somebody else is a Christian, you think, oh, well, this is great. This is going to be a good, healthy relationship that I'm getting myself into, since I've been in a 12-year abusive marriage. So I was blindsided. My entire family was blindsided because they really liked him at the time. And then whenever this occurred, I had 2 children, and of course still do have my 2 children. But he was like a father figure, wanted them to be engaging with him. And it was just, I thought, the little family, fairy tale that every woman dreams of, with a little white picket fence and the happy home. And So yes, I was very blindsided. And of course, whenever this occurred, and we had one attorney representing both of us, which was a serious conflict of interest, I was very angry over all of this. And then to find out after I was convicted, the whole time he was seeing another attorney, two other attorneys that ended up representing him afterwards, after I was convicted. So I went to prison very angry, but I didn't stay that way. Thank you, Jesus, because I did have a good foundation as a Christian, as a believer. But I had a lot of questions for God, because he's the Almighty. He can change anything. And I thought, okay, we have to have a heart to heart, because I'm not guilty. Why am I here?
Yeah.
What happened?
I mean, I have so many questions. I feel like I could talk to you for hours just going through, like, I mean, it's such a long journey and it's a crazy journey. Can you describe, I mean, the minute they say guilty and then, right then you get shuffled off, right? And then you go through the process, you get processed, you go into prison. What is that feeling like, especially knowing you didn't do this, as you're going, wow, this is it. This is my life now. I mean, what was that like in those first few moments there as you're getting processed and sent to prison?
Okay, it was unbelievable, of course, Dan and Trey. It was like what you would see on a movie or something. I could not believe this was actually happening. And I'm the oldest of 8 children, so we had never had any arrests in our family or any run-ins with the law or the justice system. So whenever I got to prison, that was like somebody dumping you off into a foreign country. I was, I had worked since I was 16. I had a middle-class family upbringing. Of course, there was dysfunction in it at that time for several years, but the outside world didn't know, which back then it wasn't common to discuss your issues with family. But whenever I went to prison and had to learn a different language, all the rules, the violence, the pat searches, the, getting stripped down in front of other offenders after visits, it was dehumanizing. It was just, it's hard to actually put in words without someone having to go through it.
Yeah.
But you get to a point where you can either do two things with the anger. And I chose not to stay in that angry mode because I'd always been a positive person. I was raised by a very good mother.
How long did that take you? I'm sorry to interrupt, but how long did that take you to kind of decide on that anger? Yeah, like to say, obviously you're angry going in and shocked and all that. Like, what was sort of like the time frame on that? Just
I would say the time frame, because I started doing my rehabilitation immediately. I started getting involved in programs, and I thought, if the state of Missouri wants me for life without parole for 50 years, then they're going to pay for me. But one thing I want them to know, I am going to fight and I am going to win in the end. And everybody kept telling me, caseworkers, the warden, Judy, you just need to accept your sentence because you're going to die here. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, I'm not. I did not do this. And of course, when people go to prison, everybody says, I'm innocent. I didn't do this. So they're used to hearing that. And so I had to actually prove my innocence in a very difficult way, not with just to the system, to the judicial system, but also to the system that I was now housed in. And getting used to not having a phone, there was just so much, because there's so little that you're allowed to have. And not having that connection with my children was probably the hardest thing that I ever had to endure while I was incarcerated.
Yeah, it was a fascinating conversation Trey and I had with her, and you can check out the whole thing over on the CBN News YouTube channel. Just look for the playlist, Faith versus Culture. It's the it's the latest one there. And she goes on to talk about her faith and how that flourished in prison, really. And, she was there for a number of years and didn't get out till just a few years ago. And so really, really incredible story there. And, a powerful testimony. Anytime somebody's facing a trial like that and they're able to keep their faith intact, it's quite something to listen to. So make sure you go and check that out. All right. That's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
We've got John 15:18. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. And when we talk about persecution or any of these sorts of issues that we talked about earlier in the show, just remembering that I do think there's some comfort in that, knowing that this comes with the territory of being a believer, as difficult as it can be.
Yeah, for sure. I think knowing that Jesus went before us, right? He went first for us and set an example of what it looks like to be obedient to the Father. I think it's a good reminder.
And also too that you hear so many times the term winsome, where we want to be winsome to everyone. Well, the world's not going to like you. They're just not. So stop trying. Stop trying to make them like us. Just share the word of God and understand that God's the one who opens eyes. God's the one who ultimately draws people to him. So until their eyes are open, they're not gonna like it. They're not gonna be welcoming to it because they're confronted with their sin and they're hostile to God. We all were at one point. So something to keep in mind for sure. Appreciate that. Make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com. That's your homework. Make sure you go ahead and do that. Lord willing, that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. See you then.